All right, looks like we can get started. There's a fair amount of people already here. I'm Luke Bagley, Outreach and Membership Manager here at Clean Wisconsin. Thank you to everyone who's here for attending our biannual Doug Follette Environmental Speakers Program. This one is going to be regarding the impacts of PFAS contamination in our state. To introduce this event, Doug Follette, the co-founder of our organization and namesake of these environmental speakers programs, is going to say a few words about the event.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's a great pleasure to welcome you all to the speakers program that I'm so proud of. Many years ago, I had the idea of doing this, and it's been very successful. I urge you all to join us as often as you can. We try to do it twice every month. The Wisconsin Environmental Decade that I started 50 years ago has become Clean Wisconsin and has become a wonderful organization. And I thank you all for taking part in this program, and I urge you all to join Clean Wisconsin and in this effort to protect Wisconsin's air and water and groundwater and chemicals, etc. So again, have a great program. I look forward to listening. Thank you all.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Doug. Our featured speaker today for this event is UW aquatic chemist, Dr. Christy Rumacall. She's going to be speaking with Clean Wisconsin Water Program Director Scott Lasser about her research focusing on one of the most contaminated areas of Wisconsin, that is the Marinette and Peshtigo area. And her research focuses on the fate of organic contaminants, including PFAS, in the aquatic environment and in water treatment systems. Christy serves as the UW Systems representative on the Wisconsin PFAS Action Council. If you have any questions throughout this panel, if you're listening on Zoom or you're listening on Facebook, just drop those comments in the question section and we'll get to them at the end. We're going to have 15 or 20 minutes to answer those questions. So all your questions are going to be answered. I'm now going to turn the conversation over to Scott and Christy. So enjoy the event.
All right, thanks, Luke, and welcome everybody. My name is Scott Lasser. I'm Clean Wisconsin's Water Program Director. I work on a bunch of water quality issues, including PFAS, and we work closely with science, government relations, and communications folks to advance PFAS policies at the Department of Natural Resources and in the legislature, and work to educate decision makers and help all of you understand some of these complex topics that are easy to set aside on a daily basis, but actually really matter for a lot of us. And today we're hoping to unpack this four-letter acronym that often comes just with those simple four letters and not a lot of context. And so really excited to have Christy today to help us do that. And to get things started, Christy, tell us about that four-letter acronym. What are PFAS and where do they come from?
Sure, thanks, Scott, and thanks for the invitation to be here. I'm really happy to join you all today, and I'll try to, it's kind of alphabet soup when we're talking about PFAS, so we'll try to make it so everyone can understand what we're talking about. So PFAS is an acronym. It stands for per and polyfluoroalkyl substances, kind of a mouthful. This acronym refers to a group of over 5,000 synthetic chemicals. So they're all man-made. We don't actually know exactly how many there are. We're learning about new ones all the time. That number kind of keeps going up and up and up. So PFAS, it's a lot of different chemicals, and they're used in a lot of different things. They have a lot of really attractive properties that are really helpful for industrial applications and consumer products. And so they're used in things that people come in contact with every day. So good examples are your, Teflon, anything that's like nonstick or stain resistant or waterproof probably has PFAS in it. So some good examples are things like Teflon pans, stain-resistant carpeting or clothing, rain jackets, grease-resistant food packaging, like your microwavable popcorn bags, that sort of thing. They're used, so things we come in contact with every day. And even though they're getting a lot of attention now, and they're sort of in the news a lot now, they've actually been around for a really long time. Some of these chemicals have been in use for decades. So they're kind of everywhere, and they've been used for a long time. Oh, Scott, you're muted. It wouldn't be a Zoom meeting without you're muted.
Thank you. Apologies. So you've given us a little bit of sense of what they are and where they've come from. Why are we concerned about them?
For a lot of reasons. I mean, the first thing that comes to mind is public health. You know, when we talk about PFAS, we are talking about thousands of chemicals, and we don't know the toxicity of all of them or even most of them. But for some of the ones that are well studied, they've been linked to a lot of different health outcomes. So some of these PFAS compounds have been linked to things like thyroid disease, decreased fertility or pregnancy complications, decreased immune response, increased cholesterol, and then in some cases, usually with like high occupational exposure, even cancer. So that's a big long list of things that none of us want to have. So that's concerning. Another thing that's concerning is some of these chemicals bioaccumulate. So that means once they're in your body, it takes a long time for them to leave. So I think it's something like 99.5% of people, so everyone listening has PFAS in them. So they are really prevalent. And they can kind of build up in the food chain. So if we think about like an ecosystem, you know, they can be found in fish and they can kind of accumulate in the food chain. So that's a problem. And then the other thing that's concerning, it kind of goes on forever, but I guess the last thing I'll say on this point is that these health effects happen at really low concentrations. So we're talking nanograms per liter or parts per trillion, which is tiny. So that number might not mean much to a lot of people. So to put it in perspective, the proposed regulation for groundwater in Wisconsin for 2 of these chemicals is 20 parts per trillion. Arsenic, which you might think about as being a poison, that's allowed to be at concentrations that are 500 times higher in our water. So we're really talking about low concentrations having significant health impacts. And that's one reason why they're getting a lot of attention now, because we can regularly measure them at these low concentrations.
And you know, you mentioned this a little bit in the first question, but so that they stick around a long time, not only in our bodies, but in the environment, which obviously causes complications. They're in a whole bunch of products. What makes them so hard to get rid of, either for our bodies or, you know, for our manufacturers and businesses that are using them?
Yeah, so both their persistence and their mobility in the environment has to do with the chemical structure. And so what makes PFAS is that they have a lot of fluorine, so that per and polyfluoroalkyl substances. It's really the fluorine that makes them so persistent. So if you look at something like PFOS, which is one of the really well-studied bad actors, and PFAS, you know, it has a whole, well, I guess all of them really have a lot of carbon-fluorine bonds. These carbon-fluorine bonds are really, really hard to break down. So some of these chemicals like PFOS don't have any known natural degradation pathways in the environment. They last a very long time. These bonds are really hard to break in the natural ecosystem, but they're also really hard to break in water treatment applications. So there are ways to remove PFAS from water, but they don't destroy the chemical. This is actually a really active area of research right now. None of our normal water treatment processes work well for degrading these compounds. So they're tricky from like an engineering perspective as well. Yeah, so I think those are sort of the big picture thoughts that I have.
Okay. And you mentioned this a little bit, you talked about mobility in water, but can you talk a little bit more about how PFAS spread through the environment? How do they, you know, what are the pathways that they end up in fish, they end up in our food, they end up in our water?
Yeah, so yeah, one thing that makes PFAS, you know, there's lots of different contaminants out there. As you know, there's lots of different kinds, and PFAS behave really differently than a lot of sort of more traditional contaminants like PCBs or things like that. And part of that has to do with their chemical structure. So if you look at the chemical, there's part of it has this long carbon backbone and it's more sticky. So it's more likely to absorb to sediment or be found in biota like fish or people. And the other part of the chemical has a charge on it, and that helps it dissolve in water. So the chemistry aside, what the chemical tells us is that it could be found anywhere in the environment. And so we need to look for it everywhere. So it could be found, it moves freely in water, they dissolve freely, and so they move around, which is a problem. They can be found in sediment, they can be found in living organisms, and so they can kind of be found everywhere, and we do find them everywhere. How they get to the environment is also, there's a lot of different pathways because they're used in so many different things and because they've been used in so many different applications for so long. So let's see. So, you know, if an industrial facility is using PFAS, that's a good way to release PFAS. Another good source of PFAS, of course, is the use of aqueous film forming foams or AFFF. A lot of firefighting foams used at the airports or by the military have PFAS in them. And so if that's not contained, that's one way to get PFAS out into the environment and really get a lot of it out there. So firefighting foams is a big one. We also often talk about wastewater treatment plants when we're thinking about PFAS. Wastewater treatment plants do not make PFAS, but they're not like really a source of it, but they aren't designed to remove these chemicals either. And so that means that PFAS that come in, whether that's from industry or from landfill leachate or anything like that, it's going to come out the other end of the wastewater treatment plant. And I mentioned this because this is a way to really distribute PFAS around the environment. So if we think about what's coming out of a wastewater treatment plant, you know, you have your water, your treated water at the end. Here in like Wisconsin, that's usually going to be discharged to like a river. And then we have our solids. The solids may be sent to a landfill as a sludge, or they may be used as biosolids, so for fertilizer on agricultural fields. The reuse of biosolids is really great from like recycling nutrients, and it's a really good thing to do. But if the biosolids have PFAS, that's another way of spreading these chemicals around the environment. So there's a lot of different ways that these things can go. Of course, landfills are another source if the leachate isn't collected. And then we've also learned from the scientific community over the last few years that PFAS can actually be found in precipitation. So in like rain and things like that. And of course that goes everywhere. So there's really no shortage of different ways to get PFAS around. And then of course, once they're in the environment, they can move freely in water, but they're also found in sediment and living organisms as well.
Okay. No, I just want to circle back briefly to something that we alluded to earlier. I've heard we don't have a master list of all of the PFAS compounds that there are out there, but people throw around numbers in the thousands. And you know, we're in Wisconsin right now, we're paying particular attention to a couple of PFAS compounds that have been around longer, PFOA and PFOS. But can you talk a little bit about maybe just at a high level, this breadth of compounds and how they might be different or not? And, you know, what can we assume if we know something about a couple of them about those other ones? Or in fact, can we not assume much about those other ones since we don't know much about them?
Yeah, this is one of the really big challenges. You know, when we think about, yeah, I mean, we don't actually know. And it's really hard because a lot of times, you know, we don't know what different companies are making or what they're using. The chemicals you mentioned, PFOS and PFOA, aren't actually made in the US anymore, but there's lots of them out there because they're so persistent and they were used for such a long time. But when companies stopped using PFOS and PFOA, they didn't stop using PFAS, the class of chemicals, they moved to different kinds of PFAS. And so there are other ones we need to study. This is challenging from a scientific perspective because, you know, for someone like me who focuses on environmental fate, which ones am I going to look for? You know, you have to sort of figure that out. From a toxicity perspective, doing toxicological testing, figuring out the toxicity of all these different chemicals is really time and labor intensive and resource intensive. And so that's a limitation. So from a regulatory side, people focus on the ones we know the most about because they can come up with standards based on what's known about toxicity. But for a lot of chemicals, we just don't know. I guess thinking about extrapolating from an environmental fate perspective, you can do that to some extent. You know, we know how the chemical structure of a compound influences its behavior. And so if you know how one compound behaves and say it's, you know, one carbon longer or one carbon shorter, you can make some guesses about what's going to happen. I think once you get into toxicity, it's harder to do that. So this is a huge challenge, and we don't know. Every time I keep seeing numbers, like you're right, it's in the thousands, and I keep seeing numbers that are higher and higher. We just don't know how many there are.
And one of the things that's just really shocking to me about our approach to PFAS compounds like this is that we've established some really legitimate health concerns and health risks associated with a couple of these key compounds, but we didn't establish those health risks before we started using them. We established those health risks decades after we started using them. And so our approach to managing these chemicals is not simply, well, let's invent one and then see what it might cause from a risk perspective, in either environmental or human health. It's let's invent a chemical, see what it does, and start using it, and we'll worry about whether it's a risk later on. And that seems really, really troubling and really challenging for, you know, someone like you who's trying to do research, and for the public health folks that are trying to come up with standards and protections and a reasoned way of managing these compounds.
Absolutely, I completely agree. It's almost like assuming innocence until they're proven guilty. And for some of these chemicals, that doesn't make sense, especially ones that, some of them like PFOS and PFOA have been used since like the 1940s and 50s. And so I'd like to think things are getting better and we're being a little bit more careful, but things that have been around a long time were just used. And then you find out decades later that they're causing really significant problems. That's a challenge. So
can you tell us, you alluded to your research, can you dig into that a little bit more and tell us exactly, which compounds you're studying, where, and kind of what you're trying to learn about them?
Sure. So my group in general studies organic contaminant fate, and we work on lots of other compounds too, like different pesticides and pharmaceuticals and kind of how they move around and how they break down and that sort of thing. So with PFAS specifically, we're studying PFAS fate in surface waters. We often think about PFAS as a groundwater contaminant, and that's true. There's lots of contaminated groundwater here in Wisconsin and elsewhere with PFAS. But what we're really looking for studying is what this means for our surface waters, so our lakes and rivers here in Wisconsin. So we do a lot of sampling here in Wisconsin. Our current work is we're focusing a lot up in the Marinette and Peshtigo region around the Bay of Green Bay. This Marinette and Peshtigo, of course, is home to the Tyco Fire Products Facility, which has made and tested these PFAS-containing firefighting foams on their site for a long time. And we know there's extensive groundwater contamination in that region, a lot of private wells and things like that impacted by PFAS. And we're looking at the surface water fate. So we're studying really from a chemical perspective and looking at a whole bunch of different PFAS, a lot of the more persistent ones. So things that include things like PFOS and PFOA and then related compounds, as well as some, there's a long list. We don't need to get into the chemistry exactly, but what we're looking for is these different compounds, where they end up in the environment. So are they mainly found in the water, or how much is found in the sediment? One thing that's interesting with these chemicals, because they have that sort of dual hydrophobic, hydrophilic nature, they're surfactants, and so they actually accumulate on the surface of the water. And so we're looking at how much accumulates on the surface. This is something people may have seen in the news, that sometimes these foams that form naturally on the water, like on a river, can contain really high amounts of PFAS because of their sort of chemical nature. So we're really studying how they move around the environment, and we're also studying loading. So if we think about like the Bay of Green Bay, for example, sampling all around all the rivers, or as many as we could around the Bay of Green Bay, which rivers are cutting in the most PFAS to like our Great Lakes, which is really important. So looking at, that's what we're doing in the natural systems work, also involved in some work doing like some PFAS sensor development, which is just getting started, and a couple of projects looking at PFAS release from waste products and things like that. So there's lots, I don't know, with from a research perspective, I think there are a lot of questions when it comes to PFAS. So we're going to be doing this for a long time. There's a lot we still have to learn.
Well, the good news is they're going to be around for a while to accommodate your research in the decades ahead.
They're not going anywhere. Yeah, that is very true. It's, have to look on the bright side, I guess. It is what it is.
So we've talked a little bit about what they are, why we're concerned about them, further efforts to understand, how they're behaving in the environment. And can you tell us a little bit about what we're doing? So what are we doing in Wisconsin? What are we doing at the national level to address obviously some of the problems and the consequences associated with this pollution?
Yeah, well, we're learning a lot, and it's, I think, a much slower process than many of us would like. I know I have colleagues at other universities who have been studying PFAS for their entire careers. So there's been scientists raising the alarm about these chemicals for a really long time. That being said, we still don't have federal regulations for them yet, although that's coming. So at the federal level, there's a health advisory level. Again, for PFOS and PFOA, these two chemicals, they get a lot of attention for good reason, of 70 parts per trillion, which many people think is too high. And this is an advisory level. It's not an enforceable standard. So it's just, if you're above 70, that's probably not good. Maybe you should do something about it, but there hasn't been a lot of testings or requirements. At the federal level, the EPA did release a roadmap in October, so a month and a half ago. And so there will be federal standards coming, but it's going to take time, years before they're released, and then it's going to take time till they're in practice. So in the meantime, states have really been taking action into their own hands. In Wisconsin, we are in the process of developing standards for groundwater and drinking water and surface water criteria. So that's in the process, and that'll still take some time, but we're kind of a little bit ahead of the federal level, which is really good because we do have a lot of PFAS contamination in our state. And one thing that's been really interesting to me is to see how, it's not just the DNR, all of our state agencies are working on PFAS. So Luke mentioned at the beginning, I'm the university representative on the Wisconsin PFAS Action Council, which was created by Governor Evers, and it has representatives from 17 state agencies. And so we put together an action plan that went to the governor in December of 2020, where we sort of outlined a lot of all the things we should be doing. And it kind of had 4 different aspects. So one was like, how can we do from preventing this problem from getting worse in the future? How can we limit future discharges? How do we figure out the extent of contamination that we have here in our state? And then what do we do about it? How do we address this? And the 4th part, which is really important as well, is maybe not as scientific or not as going out and measuring things and cleaning things up. But it's really important. It's communicating with the public. Sort of like you said at the top, this is a complex topic. So educating the public, communicating with them about risks, about PFAS. So those are the components of the action plan. And we're still meeting every so often and kind of going over the status and moving things forward. And it's been impressive for me to see how all these different agencies that you wouldn't think about are touched by this issue in some way. So Department of Education, Department of Corrections, Transportation, like everyone is impacted by PFAS in some way, and seeing the coordination within the DNR and Department of Health and everything has been impressive. It's much needed to have this much energy behind it, but it's really good to see people coming together on it. So we're working on state regulations. A lot of other states already have them, but it is kind of all over the place.
Well, in looking at the PFAS action plan that you mentioned, and we have had a chance now to talk about this sort of whole new class of chemicals. It is obviously complicated. The way they behave in the environment is complicated. But on the same token, there's an element of common sense that permeates the action plan that you all put forward. Well, let's figure out what poses risks to people. Let's test for it and figure out where it is and how much is out there. And then let's look at cleaning it up. And I think, everyone can agree that we didn't need to reinvent the wheel to come up with some of those core concepts that are in that plan. Obviously, you guys laid them out with respect to the challenge at hand here, which is this new class of chemicals. But do you feel like the state and all of the various stakeholders that are involved in this have grabbed on and latched onto that roadmap, or is there still some work to do to sort of, can we do more to move that roadmap ahead faster and more aggressively?
Yeah, I'm sure. And I think you probably know all the nitty-gritty details on some of the policy and wherever things are going than I do. Yeah, I think about the most recent WISPAC meeting that we had, and they're like, well, we're hoping for this to get moved forward, but we don't have the money, or we need the legislation to move forward. And so that's more on the political side of things, and the budgetary side of things, I think that's limiting progress. So more resources for sure are needed. Yeah.
Great. Well, that was the part of the program that we really just want to try to give everybody a foundation to understand this issue and this acronym that we often throw around as 4 letters with not a whole lot of context. And so I think Luke is gonna join us now, and we're gonna transition and have a chance to talk a little bit more about what folks can do with regard to the PFAS action plan and some of the other things the state is doing. And then obviously we're also gonna give folks in the audience a chance to ask questions.
Yeah, Scott, this question is more directed at you. What can the people that are listening, what can they do to help address, or rather draw attention to the issue of PFAS contamination?
I think that's the kind of question that I want to ask myself when I find out about something new. You know, it can be overwhelming to sort of start to wrap your head around this. And when you think about and learn a little bit about, you know, where all this stuff is showing up, everywhere from the makeup you might put on today or tomorrow, to the McDonald's wrapper that your Big Mac came in, to the rain jacket that you bought that works really well, to your carpet, to the firefighting foam at the airport that we're all counting on in the event of an emergency to help put out a fire. And so how do we rein this in? Where do we start? And I think a really basic part, and you know, Christy alluded to this already, is just we need to establish some really basic standards for some of the compounds that we know pose health risks. And thankfully, this is something that Wisconsin has been working on and has moved forward over the last couple of years. And this discussion came at a really important time, in that there are 3 different rules, 3 different sets of protections that the Department of Natural Resources is working on right now. Christy alluded to them. There are groundwater standards, which are similar to, but different than, drinking water standards. The drinking water standards are meant for municipal systems, so people who get their water in the city of Milwaukee or the city of Madison or the city of Stevens Point, or any place where you've got a municipal system serving customers. Those groundwater standards are meant to protect people with private wells. And over 1/3 of Wisconsin residents rely on private wells for their drinking water. And so this is an issue and a set of public health protections that's even more important in Wisconsin than it is in most other states. And then there are these surface water standards, and those are meant to protect people from eating fish that have too much PFAS contamination, and they are meant to protect your kids from ingesting too much PFAS when they're in the stream and not doing as good a job as we do as adults at keeping that water out of our mouths. And so we have these 3 different rules going forward right now, and they are all open for public comment. So there is an opportunity for folks to reach out to the DNR and express their support for these very basic public health protections. And I think Luke will be able to drop a link into the chat or share it with participants where you can get information about how to submit those comments. And so that's a really important, sort of very practical place to start. I would also encourage you to continue to try to learn about this issue and not feel like, you know, we knew we couldn't cover everything today. We wanted to give you a foundation and to think about where these compounds are in your life, what types of products you're using that have these compounds in them, whether you might want to make changes to what you use or how often you use it when it might have PFAS as part of the manufacturing process. And also remember that your municipal governments, your city governments are going to be a big part of the response to this too. And so ask them questions about what they're doing to address PFAS. Are they testing your water? Are they going to test your water? What are they doing to change how they fight fires with the pretty broad knowledge we have now that PFAS is in these firefighting foams? And so I think there are a lot of opportunities for us to continue to learn about this and educate ourselves and others about it, but also some very specific engagement actions to support some of the steps that the state is taking.
Yeah, I can add on to that a bit, Scott. I think that's really good. And that's some real actionable things that people can do. This is it's always hard to talk about PFAS because it's kind of a downer. There's a lot of bad news, and so it's nice to have something you can do. And one other thing, I focus a lot on water, and from human exposure perspective, ingestion is the main route of exposure. And so if your utility is testing your water, you can find out the concentrations. I don't know where everyone's joining us from, but here in Madison, the Madison Water Utility measures for PFAS and puts that data online. So like I've gone and looked up what wells serve my house and what concentrations are there. And so I really like knowing that what's in my water. So you can sort of find that out. And if not, see if your utility can test for it. There's definitely been some resistance to testing. More utilities are looking for it though. So seeing if that information out there is really helpful. And I wanted to echo what Scott said about just education for yourself, telling other people about it, and then finding out, making smart choices with the products that you're buying. So if you're going to buy a new, throw out your old Teflon pans, they're all scratched up, and you're going to buy something new, maybe get something that doesn't have Teflon. There are alternatives out there. Same thing with firefighting foams. Some fire departments are switching away from PFAS containing foams. So finding out what is happening where you live and encouraging that switch if it hasn't happened yet. There's lots of products that we don't need to use PFAS in. And so choosing PFAS-free alternatives when you can is a really good action you can take at an individual level.
And if you aren't planning to throw your old Teflon pans out, maybe reevaluate that plan is one of the things that I'm gathering, and think about exploring some new options.
Yeah. I mean, we've gotten rid of all of ours. And what they say is that if your Teflon isn't scratched, it's not getting into your food. Once it starts getting scratched, that's got to go. But yeah, we're all cast iron and carbon steel, stainless steel in my house.
Thanks, guys. I also, I just added into the chat the link to submit comments to the DNR. I put that on Facebook as well. But if you're watching this later, you can just go to our website, and it's under the Take Action page. So if you go to cleanwisconsin.org and click Take Action, it'll walk you through how to submit comments pretty easily. We talked a lot about the science behind PFAS, but I'd like to talk a little bit more about the policy. So Scott, can you tell us, is there any opposition to setting water quality standards to protect public health?
Yeah, that's a good question. And the short and unfortunate answer is yes. I think, as I alluded to a few minutes ago, when Christy mentioned the PFAS action plan that the state put forward, it feels eminently sensible in terms of what you would do with the emergence of a new set of chemicals or pollutants that pose public health risks. And yet what we have seen in Wisconsin over the last couple of years are certain groups, and often they are groups that represent PFAS manufacturers or heavy PFAS users, or are groups that historically are circumspect and critical of just a whole host of public health protections, come out against some of these very basic initial steps. And so it's pretty straightforward that people should have a right to know what's in their drinking water. And yet we have seen folks oppose resources and efforts just to do some of that basic drinking water testing. Of course, if we don't even know what's in our water, it's hard to start the process of cleaning it up or preventing more pollution from getting into it. One of the reasons that I asked you to consider submitting public comments on these 3 rules that are being considered right now is that we know we're going to see opposition to those rules. And again, we are working on setting standards right now for 2 PFAS compounds that are no longer manufactured in the United States, because we know so much about how many health risks they pose to people. And so the idea that we would struggle to set up these public health protections for compounds that are pretty widely recognized to present a whole host of risks doesn't bode well for the additional steps that we're going to need to take going forward in wrapping our heads around many of the other PFAS compounds that are out there, and in trying to better understand the risks that they pose. And this is in no way meant to demonize every single one of these chemicals, in the same way that it's not fair to say well, we should just go ahead and use them and we'll worry about whether they affect public health later. We can't simply say, well, one of these causes these health consequences, so we're just going to write them all off and stop. I think we do benefit from these compounds, and there is a reason sometimes that they are used in certain processes and in certain manufacturing. And I think what we really need to aspire to is a middle ground where we recognize that these compounds are probably not going to stop being used, but that we use them in much more responsible ways. We do more work to understand the health consequences that they pose. We do a better job disposing of them. We look for ways to eliminate their use, and we try to balance the benefits that they give us with the health consequences that they pose. And so, again, really common sense set of steps that the state has laid out to act. And I think it's also important to emphasize, because Christy mentioned the federal government has announced steps, and if we are able to push standards forward, some of those protections in place by next. And so it is critical, especially in communities that already have this PFAS pollution, that we get these standards in place of cleaning up pollution that's out there.
I think you cut out a little bit there at the end, Scott, but I think we got the gist of it. I was going to add a little bit, there's certainly resistance from industry and chemical manufacturers. There's also been a lot of hesitance in like the drinking water and wastewater sectors for testing, which is, I guess I understand it, because if you know you have a problem, then you have to do something about it. But I guess I like data and I like knowing. So hopefully we'll move past that and people will be testing it. It's, one big challenge is that, and I think a big part of why there's so much resistance is because we don't have a really good solution for cleaning water yet. There are ways, to remove the chemicals from water, but then you have your sort of contaminated filter that you have to dispose of. And that's really challenging. So it's expensive. So I think that's one reason from like a utility perspective why people are hesitant as well. Scott, what you mentioned about finding a middle ground and like knowing we're going to keep using PFAS, I think is an important point as well. And I wanted to echo that. There's been a lot of talk in the scientific community about defining this term or the idea of essential use. So acknowledging that there are some applications for which these chemicals are really valuable. So maybe it's fireproof clothing that our firefighters are wearing, or something that's like really giving a real benefit, something we can't replace. And then if we can move to something else, do that. Use the alternatives when we can, but sort of defining and laying out like, when do we actually need to use these chemicals? And I think from the environmental perspective, along with that, it's thinking about how to source reduction. How do we limit this contamination from getting out there in the first place? Because it is so challenging to deal with once it's been released. So there's a lot of proactive ways we can do things better going forward.
So I think we can get to some of the questions from the audience now as well, which a lot of you have asked some really good questions. Some of them have been answered, I think, since we started talking, but this one was more about the sources. The question was, is it prohibitively expensive to find the sources of PFAS contamination? So I don't know if you guys want to talk a little, this isn't directed at anyone in specific, but if you want to talk a little bit more about the sources and finding those sources.
Yeah, I can give some thoughts on that. It's complicated and it's not easy to do it sometimes. There are some places where it's pretty obvious, places that have used firefighting foams, whether it's airports or military operations, often have PFAS contamination. You can kind of figure out where it's coming from. Landfills could be a likely suspect. Like there's things that we know could release PFAS, but it's hard because these chemicals can come from so many different ways. It's really hard chemically to really figure out exactly where they're coming from in some situations. So this is something that's going on in sort of science or research, is trying to like fingerprint sources where we can say, hey, if we have this kind of mixture of specific PFAS, it's probably from a firefighting foam, or it's probably from a landfill. We're not there yet. So that poses some big challenges. Scott, I don't know if you have other
And
thoughts on that.
you know, just to build on that, yeah, I think the reality is we can learn a lot from the work that is done in the last couple of years. So we might not be able to identify every PFAS source in Wisconsin easily, but we can probably get the bulk of them just using some of the reference points we have for the research that's already been done. So Christy highlighted a host of the sort of usual suspect this stuff is coming from. And so that's a very logical place to start. And you know, I know that the Department of Natural Resources in the initial water testing that they would like municipalities to do, they didn't just randomly select municipalities all over the state. They didn't ask a single one to do it. They looked at what other states have learned from the work that they've done. They looked at where there are most likely to find PFAS contamination, and they want efforts on those locations. Match that sort of leveraging of limited resources with some broader efforts. I think we need, you know, we don't want PFAS to come back with a positive result. Otherwise, we're not testing enough. And so there's definitely a lot of work to do, but as we look to ramp this up, as we look to get a handle quickly as we can, we know to be at risk. And the last thing I'll say about that is about a little bit, but you know, there are these environmental sources that we've got a little bit better handle on, but as individuals, it's going to take some time to wrap our heads around just what we're using or wearing, as an example, in our everyday lives that might have PFAS. And I'm thinking about that as I'm looking at my shirt, and a lot of shirts come with the miracle of wrinkle-free right now or stain-resistant. Well, it's a pretty good chance that those are PFAS compounds that are providing that wrinkle-free or stain-resistant nature. And so it's again, it's going to take some time to think through this. It's going to take some time to start sending signals to manufacturers. You know, I'd actually rather have a couple wrinkles than this might put me or my kids' health at risk on that shirt to help prevent those wrinkles. And those are, again, trade-offs that it's going to take time to consider and for society and businesses and manufacturers to process.
Christy, this came up a little earlier. It was a request that you would talk a little bit about the concentrations of PFAS in fish being higher than the concentrations of PFAS in surface water.
Sure, yeah, so this has to do with how some of these chemicals can bioaccumulate. So like the PFAS compound we worry about the most in fish is actually PFOS. This one that's been not in use for a long time, but it's been around a long time. It's one of the ones that's usually in higher concentrations in water. And it's really bioaccumulative. So that means once it's inside a fish, it takes a long time. And I'm not going to remember exactly how long off the top of my head, but it takes time for that chemical to go away again. And so these chemicals can really build up and bioaccumulate in fish. And so that's why if you look at our proposed surface water criteria, the proposed limit for PFOS is the lowest one, because it is so bioaccumulative. And if you look at PFAS in fish, that's the one you find most of the time are at the highest concentrations. But yeah, it just has to do with the chemical nature and this bioaccumulation property.
Another question that came up was if there was a request, and I can follow up with this if you have a link to this, but a link to the governor's task force or documents that you've assembled regarding PFAS.
Yeah, I can look it up in a minute and post it. That's
great, and I can share that as well to all the emails of people that are attending. And another similar request was examples of communication campaigns regarding PFAS. This can be directed at both of you.
Yeah, why don't you?
Yeah, Scott. Sure. I saw that. I can't give you any sort of specific communication campaigns or educational materials. We are working on that at Clean Wisconsin. That's a big priority for us. We've really become aware, I think, as well as other organizations and folks working on this issue, that there's a lot of important basic education to do on PFAS. It's part of the reason we're having this webinar today. It is this 4-letter acronym that doesn't mean a lot to a lot of people. It's relatively new on the landscape for 99.9% of us. And we need to help people understand a little bit better just some of the basics about it and why they should care and what they can do and what other people are trying to do about it. So I would say keep an eye on our website for some more resources in the coming weeks and months. There are some other great organizations in Wisconsin and nationally that are working on PFAS and working to help people wrap their heads around this relatively new public health threat.
So it looks like that's about it for questions, unless anybody has any last minute questions. Wait a few seconds and see if anything comes up. Otherwise, just to reiterate, if you would like to, Scott talked about the DNR's comment period. That's on our website. More information about that, if you go to cleanwisconsin.org and then go to take action, you'll find more information on that. Oh, we got another question here. What is the name of the report that the EPA released?
So we can share, when Luke shares the resources on the governor's PFAS action plan, we can share EPA's announcement as well. So they laid out, Christy mentioned this, basically a blueprint for the steps that they plan to take in the next few years regarding PFAS. And I did see another question in the chat about home water systems. And I do want to point out that sometimes those systems can be the wild, wild west. And I can't sit here today and tell you for sure which ones you might consider or might not consider. But I do want to point out that PFAS are not an easy thing to get out. So just because you use a Brita, for example, doesn't mean, and I'm almost certain, and Christy might be able to back me up, she may know a little bit about this, but that your Brita is not going to filter out PFAS. So it's a very specific technology and chemistry that you need to remove these compounds from the water. And so, for example, if you know that you have PFAS contamination in the water that you're drinking, don't just spend a few minutes on Google or Amazon and find a filter that says, sure, we'll take PFAS out for you. I have a feeling there are some more technical resources out there that have evaluated some different filter options, but it's an extra level of chemistry and technology to get them out.
Yeah, I can add a little bit more to that. There are basically two different ways to remove PFAS from water right now. One, which works really, really well, is reverse osmosis. This is basically like a really tight membrane. It rejects everything except for water, basically. So you're getting super clean water through. These are expensive and they're kind of wasteful. Like you end up wasting a lot of water, so they're not super efficient, but those work really well. What's probably more common are activated carbon-based filters, which there is actually a little bit of that in a Brita, but I don't think the contact time is long enough to work super well. So like what I have at my house, for example, is like at our kitchen sink, like a drinking water filter that sits under the sink. And we found one that's been tested for PFAS removal. One tricky thing with the filters though is, well, one, the filter has to go in the landfill eventually because it gets full of PFAS. And then the other thing that's really important as a consumer is that the filter needs to be replaced periodically. You can't just put a filter and then it's going to stay there forever, because that can actually make things a lot worse for you, because they get full of PFAS and then they sort of get saturated and the PFAS can come back out again. So ours actually has a really annoying thing where it beeps at you after 6 months and you have to replace it. So it's good. It makes me do it, because otherwise you would just leave it there forever. So you have to make sure that you pick something that works well, that's been tested, like Scott said, and then maintain it the way that you're supposed to, so you can get the results out that you want.
Yeah, and I because that's such an important point, I'm just going to take the opportunity to double down on it and repeat it. So often we see people sort of invest in a filter system and not in the maintenance. And it almost isn't worth investing in the filter system unless you are going to be absolutely regimented and diligent in maintaining those filters and replacing the components of them that need to be replaced periodically, because they do stop working or they get saturated, as Christy illuminated or alluded to. And this is not just on PFAS. This is on all of the other host of contaminants that filters are meant to take out. So if you have a water filter in your home, basically for anything, and you are counting on it to work to remove that thing, whether it's lead or nitrates or PFAS or what have you, be absolutely regimented about the maintenance. There's a reason they make them beep at you until you change them, and it's so that you change them so that they are adequately protecting your and your family's health.
For sure.
Well, I don't think we have any more questions. So thank you so much for taking the time out of your day to join us and talk about this topic, Christy. And thank you so much for everyone who attended and asked questions. I think we can wrap it up.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Luke, and thanks, Christy. And I just encourage everybody, again, to look for opportunities to engage on this issue and to take action. And the comment periods that are going on right now, I know rules and regulations and water quality standards sound wonky and complicated, and they are. But at their root, they are basic public health protections, and they are out there to protect you. And so taking a few minutes to weigh in and express your support for them is a really great way to do something positive about this issue. And so definitely encourage you to do that. You can reach out to us if you have questions about doing that, and definitely consider our organization as a resource for other questions you have related to PFAS as well.
Yeah, thanks everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks.